Everyone laughed when the poor man bought a rotten boat, certain that he had wasted his last penny. But no one could have imagined what was hidden inside that old wreck. What he discovered shocked the entire town and changed his life forever. Subscribe and write in the comments, where are you watching this video from? The smell of salt hung heavy in the air as the small coastal town carried on with its rituals of gossip and judgment. It was a place where every stranger was noticed, and every local was measured by the smallest of successes or failures. Nothing remained private for long in a town like this, and when a man fell, his descent was not met with quiet sympathy, but with the kind of cruel entertainment that small communities often savor. For months, the name of Marcus Hale had been whispered with derision and pity. Once, he had run a small workshop near the docks, repairing nets, carving oars, and even building small fishing skiffs for the locals. He had been respected, if not admired, for his steady hands and quiet competence. But when the economy dipped and debts began to strangle him, his business collapsed, taking with it his pride and his sense of place. He was left with nothing but the bitter taste of failure. His wife had left years earlier, unable to live with the endless struggle, and his children were grown and gone, scattered to other towns, chasing lives far away from the suffocating routines of Harbor's End. Now Marcus was alone, and the townspeople had reduced him to an anecdote, a walking reminder of misfortune. They saw him trudging across the gravel paths near the docks with his worn boots and tired eyes, and they shook their heads. Some muttered about poor choices, others about fate. All agreed that he had become an emblem of wasted potential, and then came the day of the auction. It was an unremarkable morning in late spring when the town gathered to see what scraps would be sold from the harbor's forgotten yard. Old engines, rusted anchors, stacks of weather-beaten nets, and a few abandoned boats stood waiting for buyers who might see some value in the wreckage. Marcus arrived quietly, hands shoved deep into his coat pockets, his posture stooped but his eyes alert. He had come with a single purpose, though he had told no one of it. Among the debris there rested one particular boat, or rather the carcass of what had once been a boat. The vessel looked like it had been dragged from the depths of a nightmare. Its hull was scarred with rot, its paint peeled in strips like diseased skin, and its deck was warped from years of neglect. Birds nested in its crevices, and weeds had begun to snake their way through the seams where wood had split apart. To any reasonable eye it was beyond saving, an object destined for the scrapyard or the fire pit. But Marcus saw it and felt something stir deep within him, something that had been silent for years. He could not name it yet, but it gripped him tightly, a pull that was stronger than reason. When his bid came, the crowd laughed. They actually laughed out loud, their voices echoing across the harbor. "Marcus Hale buying that wreck," someone shouted. "He's finally lost what's left of his mind." Another voice carried over the sound of the gulls. "Maybe he'll live in it now, since he hasn't got a home worth speaking of." Laughter erupted, cruel and unrestrained, like children mocking a wounded animal. Even the auctioneer raised his eyebrows in disbelief before quickly slamming down the gavel, happy to be rid of the useless hulk. The transaction was completed in minutes, and Marcus was left standing alone beside his purchase, the derision of the town buzzing around him like a swarm of flies. He kept his gaze on the boat, refusing to meet their eyes. He had lived too long in their judgment to let it pierce him further now. Yet, inside, shame and anger twisted like twin blades. He wanted to shout at them, to demand they stop, but the words lodged in his throat. Instead, he simply reached out and laid a hand on the cracked wood of the hull, feeling its roughness beneath his palm. He let their laughter wash over him, and for the first time in months, he allowed himself the faintest flicker of defiance. He would prove them wrong. That evening, as the town's chatter continued in taverns and kitchens, Marcus remained on the shore, studying his boat. The vessel loomed before him, dark against the fading light, a broken monument to neglect. Yet, the longer he looked, the more he saw beneath the decay. He imagined it whole again, floating proud on the water, its deck polished, its sails snapping in the wind. He could see the bones of its structure, the potential hidden beneath the ruin. It was as if the boat itself whispered to him, daring him to try, to believe that something so far gone could be saved. But it would not be easy. He had little money left, almost no materials, and no allies willing to lend him tools or supplies. The town would not help him. They would rather watch him fail than risk their time or resources on what they considered foolishness. Still, Marcus was not deterred. For the first time since his life had collapsed, he had a purpose, however fragile and irrational it seemed. He spent that night on the dock, sitting on an overturned crate, listening to the creak of the wood as the tide shifted beneath the pilings. Memories drifted through him, days when his workshop had been full of noise and sawdust, when he had shaped planks into seaworthy hulls and felt the satisfaction of creation. He remembered the pride of launching a boat into the harbor, watching it take to the waves, knowing it would carry someone safely across the water. Those days were gone, but perhaps this broken vessel could give him a fragment of that feeling again. By dawn, his decision was made. The boat was not just a purchase, it was a lifeline. When the sun rose over Harbor's End, Marcus stood by the vessel once more, his tools laid out in a meager row. Around him, fishermen prepared their nets, their glances sharp with amusement as they saw him readying himself for the impossible task. One of them shook his head, muttering something about wasted effort, and the others chuckled in agreement. Marcus ignored them. His hands were already moving, testing the integrity of the wood, tapping the frame to hear where it still held strength and where it had hollowed to weakness. It was worse than he thought. Nearly every beam would need replacement. The hull would have to be stripped and rebuilt, and the deck was little more than a sieve. Yet none of it mattered. He rolled up his sleeves, set his jaw, and began. The first days were brutal. Splinters lodged deep into his skin. Sweat ran into his eyes, and his muscles screamed from the strain of lifting and tearing. He worked alone, the sounds of his effort drowned out by the mocking calls of the gulls and the faint laughter of townsfolk who passed by just to witness his humiliation. Some stopped to jeer, to offer sarcastic advice, or to predict how long it would take before the boat collapsed on top of him. Marcus said nothing. He let their words fall like stones into the sea, sinking uselessly into silence. His focus was on the wood, the nails, the stubborn persistence of his own will. As night fell, he lit a lantern and kept going. The harbor emptied of fishermen and townsfolk, but Marcus remained, the glow of his lamp a small island of determination in the darkness. Each creak of the boat, each groan of old wood became part of a private conversation between him and the vessel. He spoke to it without words, promising it new life, asking it to hold together long enough for him to see his vision through. And though his body ached and his spirit was heavy, he felt something he had not felt in years: purpose. The days turned into weeks, and still he worked. Slowly, the wreck began to change. Small victories accumulated. One section of hull strengthened, a part of the deck reinforced, a space within the cabin cleared of debris. None of it was visible to the townsfolk, who saw only the same shabby hulk when they passed by, but Marcus knew. He could feel the difference under his hands, in the subtle way the boat responded to his care. Yet the laughter did not stop. In fact, it grew louder as word spread. "Marcus is fixin' his floating coffin," they joked in the tavern. "Soon he'll sail it straight to the bottom." Children teased him when he walked through the town, and even those who pitied him shook their heads with sad smiles, convinced he was wasting what little strength he had left. But Marcus no longer cared. Their voices were distant, muffled by the steady rhythm of his hammer, the rasp of his saw, the scent of salt and wood. All that mattered was the boat and the possibility it held. He had fallen as far as a man could fall, mocked and forgotten. But here, among the splinters and the decay, he had found a reason to rise again. And though the town saw only a man clinging to wreckage, Marcus knew the truth. He had bought more than a broken boat. He had bought a chance at redemption. As spring deepened into summer, Marcus stood on the dock one evening, watching the sunset bleed across the water, painting the sky with fire. Behind him, the laughter of the town still echoed, but he no longer flinched at it. He placed his hand once more on the rough hull of his vessel and whispered to himself a vow only he could hear. This boat would live again. And when it did, so would he. The night settled over Harbor's End, and Marcus remained there in the gathering dark, already dreaming of what the next day's labor would bring. The days after Marcus made his vow were not filled with sudden triumph, but with back-breaking labor and an endless catalog of obstacles that seemed almost designed to test his resolve. The wreck of the boat loomed before him each morning, its skeletal frame reminding him of how fragile his purpose truly was. When he awoke at dawn to the cries of the gulls and the creak of the tide, his body often begged him to stay in bed, to accept defeat as the town expected him to. Yet something inside him had changed the day he bought the vessel. Each sunrise was no longer simply another day of surviving humiliation, but a step toward reclaiming himself, plank by plank, nail by nail. The first task was the simplest and yet the most daunting, to strip away the rot. He knew there was no saving the old timbers that had been gnawed by sea salt and time, and so he set about peeling the boat down to its bones. He used a pry bar scavenged from his abandoned workshop, levering up the warped planks that lined the hull. The sound of nails screeching as they were torn free filled the air, mingling with the endless rhythm of the sea. Each discarded piece of wood revealed the truth of the boat's condition. It was worse than he had let himself admit. The frame bent inward where water had seeped. Some of the beams were hollowed out like brittle bones, and rust had eaten so deeply into the iron fittings that they crumbled at his touch. By midday, sweat poured down his face and back, soaking through the thin shirt that clung to him. His hands were raw, blisters swelling where calluses had softened after years of disuse. Splinters stabbed into his fingers until they looked like pincushions. Still, he worked, his jaw set, his breath heavy but steady. To anyone watching, it must have seemed like lunacy, the efforts of a desperate man trying to revive a corpse. And people did watch. The fishermen passed by on their way to mend nets or haul in their catch, pausing long enough to shake their heads and mutter to each other. Children gathered in clusters, pointing and laughing, mimicking his motions as if to make his labor more ridiculous. One boy even called out, "You're building a coffin, old man," and laughter rippled through the group like a wave. Marcus did not look up. He had learned long ago that acknowledging mockery only fed it. Instead, he bent over his task, ignoring the sting of humiliation as though it were no more than the sting of salt in his wounds. but the words burrowed inside him nonetheless. They sharpened his determination, transformed his anger into fuel. He could feel it each time his hammer struck, each time a rotten plank fell to the ground with a hollow thud. The boat, like him, was dismissed as useless, a relic unfit for the present. But he would teach both himself and them that such judgments were premature. When darkness fell, Marcus did not stop. He lit the lantern he had salvaged from the ruins of his workshop and hung it from a nail driven into the dock post. The glow illuminated the boat in a golden halo, and in that light it looked almost otherworldly, a ruin poised on the edge of becoming something else. His shadow moved across the warped deck as he bent and lifted, his breathing loud in the silence of the night. The townsfolk were gone now, their laughter spent, but Marcus remained, driven by the need to make progress before fatigue claimed him. By the time he finally collapsed onto a coil of rope, the stars were sharp in the sky, and the boat was a little lighter, a little less burdened by decay. The following mornings repeated the pattern. He rose with the sun, stripped away what could not be saved, and slowly revealed the skeleton beneath. It was exhausting work, and more than once he feared he would find nothing worth saving at all. Yet, as the days stretched into weeks, Marcus began to notice small victories. The central beams of the keel, though battered, remained sound. A few sections of the frame still held their integrity, strong enough to serve as anchors for reconstruction. The boat was wounded, but not dead. Its heart still beat faintly beneath the ruin, and Marcus felt his own pulse echo in rhythm with it. Of course, material was a constant problem. He had no money to buy fresh timber or new fittings. What he did have was a keen eye for what others discarded. On the outskirts of town lay a scrapyard where rusted metal and broken wood were piled like corpses, forgotten by those who once valued them. Marcus became a frequent visitor, combing through the wreckage for anything that could be repurposed. He found planks from dismantled crates, sturdy enough to be cut and planed into replacements. He salvaged nails, bolts, and fragments of rope. With patience, he straightened bent iron brackets and polished away their rust until they gleamed faintly again. To the townspeople, it was scavenging. To Marcus, it was resurrection. Night after night, he carried his meager finds back to the dock, his arms aching from the weight, but his spirit oddly lightened. There was a strange satisfaction in making something of nothing, in seeing potential where others saw only trash. It mirrored his own condition, a man written off but not finished. Each piece he reclaimed and repurposed was another act of defiance, another assertion that neither he nor the boat would be left to rot. By the middle of the season, Marcus began the slow process of rebuilding. He planed the wood by hand, his strokes steady, coaxing smoothness from splintered surfaces. The rhythm of the tool against the timber became like a heartbeat, steady and grounding. He measured carefully, aligning new beams with the old structure, reinforcing the weak points with whatever scrap he could bend to his will. Some days the progress was invisible, nothing more than a few nails driven into place, but he counted every one as a step forward. Inside, he worked with almost reverent care. The cabin was a disaster of broken boards, rusted hinges, and accumulated filth. Marcus cleared it inch by inch, dragging out rotted panels and sweeping away years of neglect. At first it seemed futile, but as the rubbish disappeared, he began to see the shape of a room again. Light from the small portholes pierced the gloom, catching on the surfaces he had scrubbed clean. He could imagine it now, a space not of ruin, but of comfort, a place where a man might rest, read, even dream. and dream he did. As he worked, visions came to him, of shelves filled with books, of a lamp casting a warm glow across polished wood, of a bed where exhaustion might give way to peace instead of despair. These dreams were fragile, but they guided his hands, made his labor feel less like survival and more like creation. Slowly, the cabin ceased to be a tomb and began to resemble a sanctuary. Still, the mockery did not stop. If anything, it grew louder as word spread of his nightly labors. Men in the tavern joked that Marcus was building his own prison, a place where he could hide from the shame of failure. Women gossiped that he had lost his reason entirely, clinging to a wreck as though it could restore his dignity. Even children sang cruel rhymes about his ghost ship, chasing him down the narrow lanes with their jeers. But Marcus had learned to let their voices wash over him. He no longer flinched at their cruelty. Each insult, each laugh was transformed in his mind into fuel. He worked with the quiet certainty of a man who had nothing left to lose, but everything still to prove. The boat was not yet seaworthy, not even close, but inside he had begun to feel something shift. His hands grew stronger, his body hardened, his back straightened. He was becoming again the craftsman he once had been, the man who could shape wood and iron into vessels that carried men across water and into the unknown. By the end of that long summer, the wreck had changed in ways subtle to the eye but profound to the heart. The rot was gone, the frame reinforced, the cabin cleared and ready for rebirth. To the townspeople it remained a joke, a ruined boat sitting stubbornly on the dock. To Marcus it had become a partner, a reflection of his own battered soul. He knew there was still endless labor ahead, but for the first time in years he felt the weight of despair lift slightly from his shoulders. One evening, as the sky blazed red over the sea and the gulls wheeled above in restless circles, Marcus sat inside the half-cleared cabin and let the silence settle around him. The lantern light flickered on the walls, casting long shadows across the space that was no longer a ruin but the beginnings of a home. He ran his hand across the newly sanded surface of a beam, and, for the first time in years, he allowed himself to smile. The first steps of transformation had been taken. The boat, like him, was not yet whole, but it was alive. And, as the tide whispered beneath the dock, Marcus knew that the path he had chosen was no longer one of desperation alone, but of hope. And so the man who had been mocked and cast aside continued to build in silence, unaware that within the boat's battered frame, secrets slept, waiting for the day when his hands would uncover them. The days lengthened into weeks, and the weeks into months, until Marcus could no longer distinguish where the work on the boat ended and where the transformation within himself began. At first, his body had screamed in protest at every task, his back aching from lifting beams, his arms trembling after hours of hammering, his palms roughened and bleeding. But, little by little, strength returned to his muscles. The aches dulled into a steady endurance, and what had once left him gasping now became part of the rhythm of his days. The town still watched him with disdain, their laughter drifting across the docks as persistent as the tide. But Marcus had ceased to hear it as he once did. Instead, he listened to the sound of his tools, the scrape of his plane across wood, the steady beat of the hammer striking nails, the sigh of the sea as though it too encouraged him to continue. The exterior of the boat remained scarred and patched, a frame that looked to outsiders like the same skeleton they had mocked all along. Yet, inside, something else was taking shape. A secret world he built slowly and with an almost reverent care. It began when he cleared the last of the rubble from the cabin. He scrubbed the planks until his knuckles split, and his arms ached from hours of scouring away filth that had accumulated through years of neglect. The smell of rot gave way to the cleaner scent of salt and wood shavings, and for the first time he could imagine this space as more than a ruin. He patched the cracks in the walls with pieces of wood salvaged from crates, planed them until they blended seamlessly, and sanded the surfaces until they were smooth under his hands. Then, carefully, he built shelves into the corners, aligning them so they hugged the narrow walls without wasting an inch of space. These were not simple repairs, but acts of creation, choices born from a vision that grew clearer in his mind with each passing night. He wanted the cabin to feel like more than a vessel. It was to be a sanctuary, a place of warmth and dignity, where he could rest not as a man broken by ridicule, but as someone who had reclaimed a part of himself. When he found an old oil lamp in the scrapyard, dented and rusted but still functional, he polished it until it gleamed faintly in the lantern light. He hung it from a hook near the narrow berth he had reinforced, and when he lit it for the first time, the soft golden glow transformed the cabin. Shadows receded into corners, and the room looked alive, not as a ruin, but as a chamber filled with quiet promise. Marcus sat on the edge of the berth that night, staring at the way the lamp's light shimmered across the wooden walls, and he felt an unfamiliar warmth inside him. It was not pride exactly, nor relief, but something gentler, like the stirring of peace after years of turmoil. Books soon followed. They were not many, only a handful of volumes Marcus rescued from discarded boxes left outside the town's second-hand store. Some were novels with faded covers, others were old manuals on navigation, carpentry, or histories of seafaring men long forgotten. He cleaned each one, mending torn pages with scraps of parchment, and placed them neatly on the shelves he had built. The sight of them filled him with a strange joy. The cabin no longer seemed like an empty shell, but a place where thought and imagination could live. Often, when exhaustion pressed too heavily upon him, he would sit beneath the glow of the lamp and read a few lines, letting the words carry him beyond the confines of the dock into other worlds. Gradually, Marcus came to understand that the transformation was not only in the boat, but in himself. Each stroke of the brush when he painted the interior beams, each plank fitted into place, each nail hammered firmly into the frame. All of it worked to rebuild more than wood and iron. He was remaking the man who had once been broken by disappointment and ridicule. His back straightened when he walked. His hands grew steadier, his eyes clearer. Even his silence changed. Where once it had been the silence of shame, now it was the silence of purpose. The town, however, still saw only the ruin. From the outside, the boat was little different from the wreck it had been. They saw no shelves, no lamp, no books, no warmth taken root inside. And so the laughter continued. They jeered at his scavenging, scoffed at the nights he spent working beneath the lantern, mocked the stubbornness with which he clung to what they called a lost cause. Some even wagered how long he would last before the boat collapsed entirely beneath his hands. Marcus heard them, but he did not answer. Their words no longer cut as they once had. He knew something they did not, that within those scarred walls a new life was quietly forming, hidden from their sight. At times, he wondered at himself. How could such a wreck have become the center of his existence, the very reason he rose each morning with renewed determination? The answer came to him one night when he paused from his labor and sat in the cabin, his lantern casting shadows across the polished wood. He realized the boat had become a mirror of his own spirit. Just as he had been stripped of dignity and cast aside, so had the vessel been abandoned, left to decay. But within both of them remained a core that could not be destroyed. By rebuilding the boat, he was rebuilding himself, proving to the world, and more importantly, to himself, that what had been broken could yet be made whole again. His dreams for the cabin expanded as the weeks passed. He sewed rough cushions for the berth from old cloth sacks filled with straw, covered them with fabric scavenged from discarded curtains, and stitched every seam with painstaking care. He fashioned a small table from a salvaged door, cutting it to fit the narrow space beside the berth, and polished it until it gleamed. When he placed the lamp upon it, the cabin took on the air of a place lived in, not merely worked upon. Even the air seemed warmer, carrying the faint smell of pine and salt rather than decay. Sometimes, when the moonlight spilled across the water outside and the town had fallen into silence, Marcus would sit in that cabin and close his eyes. He could hear the creak of the hull, the gentle lap of waves against the dock, and he would imagine himself already at sea. He pictured the horizon stretching endlessly before him, the wind filling sails that had not yet been raised, and he felt a stirring in his chest that was half hope, half longing. It was in those moments that he knew the boat was no longer just wood and nails. It was becoming a vessel of dreams, a passage to a life beyond the narrow confines of the town that had mocked him for so long. The more he worked inside, the more the outside world seemed to fade. Mockery mattered less, hunger gnawed less sharply, even loneliness lost its edge. For Marcus had company now, not in people, but in the work itself, in the slow transformation of ruin into refuge. He spoke little, but in his silence grew a strength he had thought forever lost. He carried himself differently, his shoulders squared, his eyes steady. And though the townsfolk still laughed, some began to notice the change. They could not see the sanctuary he built inside the boat, but they could see the quiet determination in the man himself, and it unsettled them. They had expected his ruin to be swift, his defeat certain. Instead, he endured. On one cool evening, as autumn winds began to sharpen the air, Marcus sat in the cabin with the lamp glowing softly and a book open on his lap. He read slowly, savoring the words, and when he closed the book he looked around at the room he had created. His heart swelled with something he had not felt in years. Not pride, exactly, but gratitude. Gratitude for the chance to begin again, for the fragments of wood and metal that others had thrown away, for the stubbornness that had kept him working long after the laughter of the town had tried to break him. He ran his hand over the smooth wood of the table, and in that moment he understood that he was no longer merely repairing a boat. He was carving out a future. Outside, the tide rose and fell, the dock creaked under the weight of the vessel, and the night whispered with secrets he could not yet name. Deep within the frame of the boat, something waited for him still, something hidden, slumbering in the shadows. But for now, Marcus allowed himself the quiet triumph of knowing that the transformation was underway. The boat was no longer just a wreck, and he was no longer just a man beaten down by ridicule. Together, they were becoming something new. And so he worked on, not yet aware of the surprises the vessel still concealed, not yet knowing that the sanctuary he had built would soon open into a discovery that would shake not only the town, but the course of his own life forever. The cabin had become his refuge, a sanctuary where Marcus could sit in the glow of his lamp, surrounded by the smell of freshly sanded wood and the rustle of worn book pages. By now, the inner transformation of the vessel was well underway, and, although from the outside the boat still looked like a weathered carcass, those who stepped inside would have been astonished to find a space alive with warmth, order, and quiet dignity. Marcus himself often marveled at the change. The shelves stood neatly in their corners, holding his modest collection of books. The berth, cushioned and covered with stitched fabric, looked inviting even on the coldest nights. The lamp burned cleanly above the small table, casting its soft glow on polished planks. It was as though the boat had learned to breathe again, its heart rekindled by the stubborn devotion of a man long cast aside by others. Yet, despite the progress, Marcus always sensed something incomplete, as though the vessel still held secrets that he had not uncovered. It was during one of his endless nights of labor that the mystery revealed itself. He had been reinforcing the inner panels along the starboard wall, prying away rotten boards so he could replace them with salvaged planks. His hands, by now accustomed to splinters and strain, worked with practiced rhythm. But when his chisel slipped into a narrow seam, the sound it made was not the dull resistance of timber, but a hollow echo. Marcus paused, frowning. He tapped the surface lightly with the handle of his hammer. The thud was muffled, as if behind the boards there was a cavity. Curiosity prickled at him, swift and undeniable. He pried harder, forcing the wood apart until one of the planks gave way. A cloud of dust billowed into the air, choking him with the stench of time and neglect. Marcus leaned closer, peering into the dark space revealed by the gap. It was a compartment, narrow and hidden between the outer hull and the inner wall. At first he saw nothing but shadows, but when he angled his lamp closer, the light glinted on something metallic. His pulse quickened. Slowly, carefully, he reached inside. His fingers brushed against a rough surface, then cold iron. He pulled, straining until a small chest, corroded by salt and years of disuse, emerged from the cavity and landed heavily on the floorboards. For a long moment, Marcus only stared at it. His breath came hard, and his heart thudded with an intensity that seemed to shake his very ribs. The chest was no larger than a fisherman's tackle box, but its weight suggested it held more than scraps. He crouched before it, brushing away grime with trembling hands. The lock had long since rusted through, and with a little force from his chisel, it snapped apart. The lid creaked open, and Marcus found himself gazing at a collection of objects that would change the course of his life. The first thing he noticed were the coins. Dozens of them lay scattered at the bottom, their golden surfaces dulled by time but unmistakably precious. They bore strange markings, some etched with faces of men long gone, others with symbols Marcus did not recognize. He lifted one, feeling its weight, and for the first time in years he whispered aloud without meaning to, a sound half disbelief, half reverence. Beneath the coins lay folded papers, yellowed and brittle, tied together with a cord that crumbled at his touch. He untied them carefully, spreading them open across the table beneath the lamp. They were maps, old, hand-drawn charts marked with faded ink, showing coastlines that looked familiar yet subtly different from the modern maps he had seen. Routes were marked with dotted lines, some trailing into uncharted waters, others circling small islands whose names he had never heard. Beside the maps were documents written in an elegant script, words that spoke of cargo, voyages, and destinations that hinted at wealth lost to history. Marcus's mind spun. What had he found? A smuggler's cache, a sailor's hidden record of forbidden journeys. As he turned the papers, a page slipped free, more brittle than the rest. On it, drawn in careful ink, was the outline of a coastline with a red mark on a secluded cove. Next to the mark was a note. The ink blurred but still legible enough to suggest significance. Safe harbor, final rest. His chest tightened. He could hardly comprehend the weight of what lay before him. Gold coins, maps, notes that whispered of hidden histories. He had stumbled upon a legacy buried in the bones of the boat itself. For hours, Marcus sat in the lamplight, studying the contents of the chest. His mind wandered through countless possibilities. Could these coins be relics from centuries past, part of a treasure lost at sea? Could the maps point to locations where a forgotten cargo still lay waiting to be discovered? The implications staggered him, but alongside the awe came caution. If the townsfolk ever discovered what he had found, they would not laugh any longer. No, worse. They would circle him like gulls around a catch, tearing at him with greed until nothing remained. He knew their cruelty too well. He had seen their envy when others stumbled upon fortune, their quickness to snatch what did not belong to them. He could trust no one with this secret, not yet. He cleaned each coin meticulously, stacking them in neat piles upon the table before returning them to the chest. He folded the maps with care, treating them as though they were as fragile as his own beating heart, and placed them back within the box. Then he sealed the chest once more, sliding it into a corner where he could keep watch over it. But though he tried to sleep that night, rest eluded him. His mind churned with visions of distant voyages, lost fortunes, and the chance, at last, for redemption. The days that followed were restless ones. Marcus continued his work on the boat, but now each hammer stroke, each board fitted into place, felt different. The vessel no longer carried only his hope for renewal. It bore a secret treasure, a hidden history that bound his fate to something far greater than he had imagined. When he sat in the cabin at night, he no longer read his books. Instead, he pored over the maps, tracing the faded lines with his finger, memorizing the symbols and the marks. He tried to decipher the handwriting, piecing together the story of whoever had hidden the chest. What struck him most was the deliberate nature of the concealment. The chest had not been abandoned haphazardly. It had been hidden with purpose, as though someone had intended it to remain undiscovered until the right hands uncovered it. Marcus wondered if he had been chosen by chance or by fate. After all, no one else in the town would have bothered to strip the boat to its bones, to rebuild it from within. Perhaps it had been waiting for someone stubborn enough, desperate enough to look deeper than appearances. One evening, as he studied the maps beneath the lamp, Marcus caught himself smiling. The laughter of the townsfolk still echoed outside, but it no longer stung him. They saw only the ruin he had purchased, the foolish man laboring over a carcass of wood. They did not see the gold coins stacked in the chest, the maps whispering of forgotten voyages, the treasure hidden in plain sight. The secret was his alone, and with it came a newfound strength. Yet with that strength came unease. Secrets of such magnitude could not remain hidden forever. He began to notice the way some townsfolk lingered longer than usual near the dock, their eyes sharp with curiosity. He caught whispers when he walked past, not just of mockery now, but of suspicion. Perhaps they had seen the light burning late into the night. Perhaps they had glimpsed his excitement despite his attempts to conceal it. Whatever the reason, Marcus knew that discovery by others would bring danger. He would need to guard his treasure and himself with caution. Still, he could not quell the exhilaration that burned within him. Each time he touched the coins, he felt the weight of history pressing into his palm. Each time he traced the lines of the maps, he felt the call of the sea urging him toward horizons he had never dared to imagine. The boat was no longer simply his refuge. It had become a vessel of destiny, carrying within it not only his dreams of redemption, but a secret powerful enough to change the course of his life. And though he did not yet know it, The time would soon come when the laughter of the town would turn to silence, their mockery to awe, as the truth of what he had discovered within the heart of his battered boat came to light. The discovery changed Marcus in ways that were at once subtle and profound. In the days that followed, he no longer moved with the heavy weariness of a man dragging the weight of mockery behind him. Instead, there was a certain sharpness to his step, a brightness in his eyes that he could not fully disguise. He tried to conceal it, to go on as though the chest and its secrets were not burning inside his thoughts like a fire. But even as he worked on the boat, his hands carried a new steadiness, his posture a quiet pride that had been absent for years. He would pause often, listening for footsteps on the dock, aware that prying eyes might linger. The chest remained hidden in the cabin, and he told himself he would keep the secret sealed until he had gathered the strength to know what to do with it. But secrecy has a way of drawing suspicion, and soon the town began to notice. It started with whispers. Marcus had grown used to hearing laughter drift across the dock, to hearing his name tossed about in jokes at the tavern. But one evening, as he walked past the market stalls with his head down, he noticed the laughter had changed. There were murmurs now, half-suppressed voices that quieted when he drew near. He could feel their eyes on him, not just amused, but calculating, measuring him in some new light. Later, he heard one fisherman mutter to another, "Strange how he keeps at it, night after night. Strange how he looks these days." Marcus clenched his jaw and walked on, but he knew that the balance had shifted. The shift grew more obvious as the days lengthened. People began lingering longer near the dock where his boat rested. Their conversations stretched thin as their gazes wandered over his work. At first, he told himself it was only curiosity, a new form of ridicule, but he soon recognized envy in their eyes. They noticed the way he carried himself, the way he seemed less burdened than before, the way a faint smile sometimes tugged at the corner of his mouth when he thought himself alone. The town was small, and small towns feed on rumor as surely as gulls feed on scraps. Speculation soon bloomed, each voice adding to the growing suspicion until it became common talk. Marcus had found something in that boat. He heard it first at the tavern door. Passing by one night, he caught the sound of his name. He slowed, pressing himself against the shadows of the wall, and listened. A woman's voice hissed with certainty. "I tell you, he's hiding something in there. No one works like that without reason." Another voice, lower and sharp, replied, "Treasure, maybe. These old boats carried more than fish, you know. Smugglers, traders, soldiers, anything could be buried in those hulls." The laughter that followed was tinged with greed rather than derision, and Marcus felt a chill coil down his spine. The town was beginning to understand. He redoubled his caution. The chest remained hidden in its corner, covered now by planks and cloth. At night, when he studied the maps, he did so with the lamp turned low and the door barred. But secrecy could only hold so long when the air itself seemed to whisper of wealth. Soon, even those who had mocked him most viciously began to change their tune. Where once they had laughed at his purchase, now they came with feigned friendliness, their words sticky with false concern. "Marcus," one man greeted him one morning, leaning casually against the dock post. "You've put a lot of work into that wreck. It's coming along, isn't it? Must feel good to have something worth your time." His eyes flicked past Marcus toward the boat's cabin, sharp with questions unspoken. Marcus grunted a reply and turned away, but the encounter left him uneasy. Others followed. A pair of fishermen brought him a coil of rope one evening, claiming they had no use for it and thought he might need it. Their smiles did not reach their eyes, and Marcus felt the weight of their gaze following him long after they left. Even children, once content to mock him with cruel songs, now crept closer to the dock, peering through gaps and whispering among themselves about what might lie within the boat's walls. The town had turned, not with kindness but with hunger. The moment of revelation came sooner than he expected. One night, after hours of work sanding a new section of the deck, Marcus stepped outside to stretch his back. The moonlight lay silver across the water, and the town was quiet but for the faint creak of boats rocking against their moorings. He was about to return inside when he noticed movement on the dock. Two figures crouched near his boat, their hands groping along the outer planks as though searching for entry. Marcus's blood surged hot with fury. He strode forward, his footsteps loud on the boards, and the intruders leapt up, startled. They were men he knew from the tavern, their faces twisted in the half-light with guilt and fear. Without a word, they fled, their boots thudding away into the night. Marcus watched them go, his chest heaving. By morning, the whispers were no longer whispers. They were declarations, bold and certain. The whole town buzzed with talk that Marcus had uncovered something extraordinary. They no longer laughed when they spoke his name. They spoke with envy, with resentment, with awe they dared not yet admit. Where once they had mocked the ruin he purchased, now they craned their necks to catch a glimpse of what lay inside. For the first time in years, Marcus walked through the market, not as the town's fool, but as its enigma. He could feel the weight of their curiosity pressing against him, a burden as heavy as the years of ridicule had been. And yet, beneath the unease, Marcus felt a flicker of triumph. The transformation was undeniable. Those who had spat their laughter now tasted silence. Those who had jeered now strained to understand. The boat, which they had once called a wreck, had become a symbol of his defiance and his fortune. He had guarded its secret well, and though suspicion spread, no one could prove what he had found. It was his alone, a truth that gave him a strength they could not touch. But Marcus also knew that secrets such as his had a way of drawing out the worst in people. The glances he received were no longer mocking, but hungry. The kindness shown to him was barbed with ulterior motives. He could sense the danger rising, the shift in the town's tide as surely as he could read the changing current of the sea. If he faltered, if he revealed too much, they would descend upon him without hesitation. He must move carefully now, guarding not only his treasure, but the new respect, however grudging, that it had bought him. The irony was not lost on him. The same voices that had derided him as a fool now filled the air with speculation about his wisdom, his fortune, his luck. The same faces that had sneered at his labor now studied him with unease, wondering what power he held in his hands. It was as though the entire town had turned on its axis, shifting from mockery to awe. And Marcus, standing at the center of it all, felt both vindicated and endangered, elevated and isolated. As he lay in his cabin that night, the chest hidden beside him, Marcus thought of the maps, the coins, the red mark on the page that promised more than he could yet imagine. He thought, too, of the town outside, buzzing with suspicion, ready to tear him apart if given the chance. He realized then that the boat had become more than a refuge, more than a symbol. It was his fortress, his secret, his destiny, and if he guarded it well, it would not only silence their laughter, it would lead him to horizons far beyond the reach of their envy. The town was in shock, but Marcus knew this was only the beginning. The town had shifted in its stance toward Marcus, but the change was not one of simple acceptance. Suspicion, envy, and hunger hung in the air, and though laughter had died away, in its place had come an uneasy silence filled with speculation. Marcus could feel it everywhere he went, in the way shopkeepers paused in their counting when he entered, in the way conversations faltered mid-sentence as he passed, in the watchful eyes that followed him from window to window when he walked through the streets. The mockery that had once weighed upon him had given way to a more dangerous form of attention, and he knew that secrecy alone would no longer protect him. He needed something more, something that would not only confirm his discovery, but also secure his place beyond the reach of doubt. The chest, though hidden, called to him nightly, and the maps within burned like fire in his thoughts. He had studied them for weeks, tracing the faded lines with a steady finger, comparing them to the coastline he knew so well. His suspicion that they were genuine grew stronger each day, but suspicion was not enough. He needed certainty. It was with that determination that he reached out, cautiously, to a man he had once known in his youth, a historian who still resided in the larger town upriver. They had not spoken in years, but Marcus trusted him more than the greedy eyes of his neighbors. Wrapping the maps in cloth, Marcus traveled under the cover of dawn, leaving the boat secure behind him. The meeting was tense at first, for the historian had aged and grown cautious in his dealings, but when Marcus laid out the maps across the man's desk, the historian's eyes widened with a shock he could not conceal. His hands, though trembling with age, moved quickly as he examined the faded ink, the markings of places once known and others now long forgotten. He spoke in fragments, at first whispering as though afraid the walls might overhear, then louder as his excitement overcame restraint. These were not forgeries, he declared, nor the ramblings of some sailor's imagination. They were authentic, maps drawn during a period of war and trade when fortunes were moved in secret, when gold and supplies vanished into the sea only to be whispered about for generations. Marcus listened with growing awe and fear. The historian explained that the red mark he had puzzled over was no random flourish, but a symbol used by certain groups to denote a cache, a hidden reserve of wealth meant to remain unseen. If Marcus had the maps, then he possessed knowledge that others would kill to obtain. It was both a blessing and a curse, the historian warned him, and Marcus understood in that moment how precarious his position truly was. Yet, with danger came validation. He was no longer the fool with a broken boat. He was the keeper of something real, something history itself could not ignore. Word spread, as word always does, though Marcus had begged for discretion. The historian, for all his integrity, could not restrain his excitement and shared his discovery with colleagues. By the time Marcus returned to his town, the whispers had grown into open talk. People no longer approached him with false kindness, but with open greed, demanding to know what else he had found, pressing him with offers to buy the boat, to buy the maps, to buy him out entirely. They crowded him at the docks, their faces pale with desperation, their voices sharp with envy. But Marcus, fortified by the historian's confirmation, no longer bent beneath their words. He stood taller now, speaking calmly, brushing off their demands with the quiet authority of one who knows his worth. The authorities, too, took notice. Men from the coastal office arrived, their uniforms stiff, their eyes suspicious. They asked questions, inspected the boat, and examined the chest and coins Marcus reluctantly revealed. For hours they tested and probed, but in the end they could not deny the truth. The items were genuine, their history undeniable. Papers were drawn, signatures signed, and with those papers came legitimacy. Marcus was now recognized not as a fool, but as the discoverer of a significant historical find. Compensation was arranged, a reward not only for the gold, but for the preservation of history itself. The sum was far beyond anything Marcus had ever imagined owning, enough to erase debts that had haunted him for years, enough to secure a future he had thought lost. The day he received the reward, Marcus walked through the town with a silence that was louder than any shout. No one mocked him now. The shopkeepers who had once sneered at his presence greeted him with forced smiles. Those who had thrown laughter like stones in his path now lowered their heads in shame. Even the tavern, once filled with jeers at his expense, grew quiet when he entered, every eye turning toward him with a mixture of awe and regret. The transformation was complete. Marcus, once the town's disgrace, had become its silent victor. But wealth was not the only gift he had gained. Respect, though grudging, came hand in hand with it. Men who had refused to work alongside him now sought his advice. Young ones who had taunted him watched in silence as he passed, no longer daring to sing their cruel songs. And though Marcus accepted their changed behavior with outward calm, inside he felt a strength that no coin could buy. He had endured their scorn. He had weathered their laughter. And now he stood before them not by luck, but by resilience. The boat had been his burden, his labor, his sanctuary, and now it was his triumph. Yet Marcus knew better than to rest easily. Recognition brought its own dangers. Envy still glowed in the eyes of many, and greed remained a shadow that clung to him. He guarded the remaining secrets of the maps with renewed determination, sharing only what was necessary to secure his standing. The rest he kept locked within his mind and within the hidden compartments of the boat. For all their newfound respect, he could not trust the town entirely. They had shown him their true nature in their laughter, and though their tones had shifted, the hunger remained. Still, the change in Marcus was undeniable. No longer hunched beneath the weight of mockery, he carried himself with the dignity of one who had endured trial and emerged victorious. He spoke little, but when he did, people listened. His hands, once cracked from labor that seemed futile, now moved with the assurance of a man shaping his own destiny. And each evening, as he stood upon the deck of his boat and looked out toward the horizon, he felt not only vindication but the stirring of something greater. The sea called to him more strongly now, its vastness no longer a symbol of isolation but of possibility. Recognition had given Marcus more than wealth. It had given him back his belief in himself. For years he had been defined by failure, by the laughter of others, by the weight of his own silence. Now he was defined by resilience, by discovery, by the strength he had forged in solitude. And though the town's respect was shallow, though it came too late and too begrudgingly, it no longer mattered. What mattered was the fire within him, a fire that no laughter could extinguish and no envy could dim. As the sun set one evening, casting the harbor in shades of gold, Marcus stood on the deck and breathed deeply of the salt air. Behind him lay recognition and strength, the validation he had fought for without even knowing it. Before him lay the open sea, wide and waiting. The time was coming when he would no longer need the town at all, when he would leave behind its whispers and its envy. The maps promised more than they could ever understand, and Marcus, stronger now than he had ever been, was ready to follow their call. The town had given him recognition, but the sea promised freedom. And Marcus, with new strength in his heart, knew that his journey was only beginning. Recognition had changed Marcus's life in ways he had never imagined, But in the quiet of his nights aboard the boat, he understood that this chapter was not the end of his journey. It was only the prelude to something larger, something he had longed for but had not dared to admit even to himself. Standing on the deck as the town shifted uneasily between admiration and envy, he began to feel the pull of the horizon more strongly than ever before. The sea had always been there, whispering promises of freedom and distance, but now, with his boat restored and his heart fortified, those promises were no longer unreachable dreams. They were within his grasp, waiting for him to choose the moment to seize them. The weeks that followed his recognition were filled with activity, though of a different kind than before. No longer did he labor under the weight of rotten planks and rusted bolts. Instead, he oversaw the finishing touches to his transformation. The exterior of the boat, once mocked as a shell unworthy of repair, was now clad in fresh timber and polished paint, its lines strong against the water. The name he had chosen for it, carefully painted on the stern in letters both proud and simple, was a symbol of his own rebirth. He had decided to call it the Horizon's Grace. To him, it was more than a vessel. It was the embodiment of resilience, of hope restored, of the promise that no man's laughter could truly bury another's dreams. Inside, the boat reflected the work of his hands and his vision. Where once there had been decay, there was now warmth and light. The small cabin glowed with oil lamps set in fixtures he had polished until they shone like gold. The shelves he had built stood firm against the swaying of the water, lined with books he had collected since boyhood and never before had the courage to keep in a place of honor. A narrow bunk with clean linen offered rest at the end of long days, and a table built from reclaimed wood bore the scars of his work, but stood proudly as the center of the little home he had created. Even the hidden compartments, now carefully sealed, remained part of the story, a reminder that within every surface lay secrets that only time would reveal. But it was not only the boat that had changed. Marcus himself had been altered by the journey. The weight of mockery no longer bent his shoulders, and the fear of poverty no longer clouded his thoughts. Where once he had hesitated to lift his gaze in the streets, now he walked with quiet strength, no longer needing to explain himself to those who had judged him. He carried with him the knowledge that he had endured and prevailed, and with that knowledge came a clarity that shaped his every decision. He was no longer bound to the rhythms of a town that had offered him nothing but scorn. His future lay in the direction of the horizon, where the sea stretched endlessly, free from envy, free from the chains of small minds. The night before his departure, Marcus walked through the town one last time. The streets, dimly lit by lanterns, seemed smaller now, as though they had shrunk to fit the narrowness of the people who inhabited them. Doors closed quickly when he passed, voices hushed, but no laughter rose to follow him. He paused at the dock where once the boat had sat in ruin, derided by all, and looked out at it now, proud and ready. A sense of calm washed over him, stronger than triumph, deeper than revenge. He did not feel the need to gloat or to remind them of their cruelty. Their silence was enough. The sight of the boat itself was enough. They had seen what he had built, and that truth would remain long after he was gone. Dawn broke clear and bright, the sky painted in strokes of rose and gold. A crowd gathered at the dock, drawn by curiosity and by the unspoken knowledge that something final was about to happen. Some came with genuine respect, others with the last remnants of envy, but all came because they could not stay away. Marcus stood tall among them, his face calm, his eyes fixed on the sea. He loaded the last of his supplies onto the boat, provisions, charts, a few treasured belongings, and then turned once to face the people. No words were spoken, for there was nothing left to say. They had mocked him, doubted him, envied him, and at last they had witnessed his vindication. Now they would watch him leave, and in his leaving they would know that their power over him was gone forever. The ropes were cast off, the boat eased gently into the current, and Marcus took his place at the helm. His hands, once raw from desperate labor, now gripped the wheel with certainty. The engine hummed steadily beneath him. The sails caught the morning wind, and slowly, gracefully, the horizon's grace moved away from the dock. The crowd shifted uneasily, their silence broken only by the cries of gulls overhead. Some raised their hands in a hesitant farewell, others simply stared, but Marcus did not look back. His eyes were fixed forward on the widening path of water that stretched before him. As the shoreline receded, the boat seemed to grow smaller in their sight, but in Marcus's eyes the world itself was expanding. The sea opened before him like a vast canvas, unmarked, waiting for him to paint upon it the life he chose. The maps, the hidden treasures, the possibilities of discovery, all of it lay ahead. Yet beyond even those promises was the deeper truth. He was free. Free from ridicule, free from the narrow confines of a town that had never believed in him. The laughter that had once haunted his every step was now only a memory, swallowed by the endless sound of waves against the hull. Marcus breathed deeply of the salt air, the wind cool against his face, the sun warm upon his shoulders. Each moment carried him farther from the past. Each wave lifted him closer to the future. The boat moved steadily, carrying not just a man but the embodiment of a struggle overcome. He thought of the years of humiliation, of the nights spent working alone while the town mocked him, of the doubts that had nearly crushed his spirit. All of it had led to this moment, and in this moment he knew he had not been broken. He had been forged. The horizon stretched before him, endless and shimmering. Marcus stood at the helm of his creation, his home, his triumph, and guided it forward into the unknown. The world was wide, and the sea was calling. With the town behind him and the open water before him, he set his course, not for a destination marked on any map, but for the life that awaited him beyond the reach of those who had once defined him. The open sea welcomed him, vast and unyielding, a place where no man's laughter could follow and no envy could chain him. And so, as the horizon's grace sailed toward the rising sun, Marcus left behind not just a town, but an old life. What lay ahead was mystery, promise, and freedom. The boat cut through the waves, steady and sure, and Marcus, with strength renewed and recognition secured, embraced the horizon as his own. His journey had begun anew, not in defeat, but in victory, and the sea, endless and eternal, carried him into the future he had always deserved. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next shocking stories. Click now to watch the next video. It's even more unbelievable than this one. And if this story stunned you, share it with your friends so they can be just as amazed.